This video clip will be very different to all the others. Let me explain. In this clip, what I'm going to do is give my testimony of how I came to the New Covenant theology position. Now, I want to add straight away that I'm not doing this because I think my testimony is especially important, or because I think I'm important, nor am I making it normative for everybody else. But it is my testimony. It is how I came to New Covenant theology, and it might help somebody else. I know many people are thinking very seriously now about New Covenant theology. Perhaps they're a bit anxious about it, a bit fearful. They think it's odd or something, but they are attracted to it for various reasons. And perhaps my experience, and it is my experience, might help somebody else. I was converted in 1956, just before my 16th birthday. I was baptized that same year. Now, the church where I was converted was really not theological at all. It had just come out of a period of dreadful misunderstandings about the gospel, a shocking state. An Arminian gentleman, young man, had been appointed its pastor, and he had drawn this woolly church into an earnest evangelical position. God had used him in his earnestness to bring many people there, several people, many people, to an evangelical position. And I was converted in that place. At that time, I was a young believer, of course, and I was an Arminian, and I suppose I was a secret rapture man. But to say that is to put too elevated a gloss on where I was, because I had no theology at all. I was just earnestly evangelical and evangelistic. There was no system about it at all. But a year later, just after I was 17, I started to preach. The church called a pastor, an older man. The first man had left. They called a pastor who introduced me to the idea of Calvinism. At that stage, I was an Arminian, as I say, not because of any system or scripture. I just thought it was obvious and fair. And when this man introduced the idea of Calvinism to me, I rejected it out of hand. I dismissed it. Argumentative, I just said, no, it can't be. But he also introduced me to the premillennial position away from the secret rapture, and I did see that was better. But within a few weeks, I was up at university. And looking back now, that October, that late September, October in 1958, I immediately took a stance at university on the position of free and sovereign grace. And this attracted a young man, a fellow student, a Dutch Reformed man, into fellowship with me. And soon there was an Anglican also who came into our company. And the three of us nourished each other in what you might call Calvinism. It was getting more systematic, but it still was a long way from any system. I was a Baptist. This Dutch Reformed man and the Anglican, of course, were infant baptizers. But we had fellowship together and nourished each other in our sovereign grace position. The young man who was Dutch Reformed came to see believer's baptism. But as for my own experience, I came across, about 1958, I suppose, yes, it must have been 58, I came across the Banner of Truth books. My eye fell upon Thomas Watson's exposition of the Westminster Confession or Catechism. Now, what attracted me was the recommendation by a man called Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Now, I knew Spurgeon was a good man. I'd heard about that in the sermons, I suppose, over the few years I'd been converted, and I knew that vaguely that Spurgeon was reliable. And so I bought this book, and I started collecting books, old books, reformed books. I used Jim Packer's recommended list, and I began to hunt for books. And my theology was growing at this time. I used to spend my Sunday afternoons copying out Berkhoff's systematic theology, thinking that I was grounding myself in solid teaching. Of course, I was still a Baptist, so I saw the difference there, but nevertheless, I was getting more and more solidly reformed, Calvinistic. Through William Henriksen's books, I think it must be, I adopted the amillennial position. About this time, a friend introduced me to the Plymouth Brethren, and I found great joy in worshiping in the assembly. And for a while, I left my reformed position. I put it, as it were, on the back burner, although the early brethren, many of them had been Calvinistic. I married after university, and we joined an assembly. But being in the assembly, I saw its drawbacks. I saw the advantages, getting back closer to the New Testament, but I saw that the practical difficulties and the lack of systematic teaching. And so by the mid-60s, I had moved back to the Reformed position. And now I wanted to enter the strict Baptist ministry. The strict Baptist ministry, strict Baptist means closed communion, and it also involves particular redemption, as opposed to general redemption, the general Baptist. In other words, Christ died for the elect, and not for all men. That was my position. I was reformed. I never did enter the strict Baptist ministry, although I preached among them, and in other churches as well. But through various circumstances, in the mid-70s, late 70s, my wife and I, with 3 other people, were led to form a church. And the church we formed was a Reformed Baptist church. Its confession used the 1689 and the Synod of Dort. We said we broadly and generally agreed with the 1689 and the Synod of Dort. We said broadly and generally because we didn't want to investigate every last detail at that stage. We were fighting for our lives, if you like, spiritually speaking, trying to keep our heads above water. But that was our position, a Reformed Baptist church. In the mid-80s, I was preaching. By that time, I was separated to preach pretty often in this church. I was the regular teacher. There was another elder by now, and I had about 2/3 of the teaching. And my practice was, and my fellow elders' practice too, we would systematically go through books of the Bible. And in my years of this, I preached through many, many of the books of both Old and New Testaments. About the mid-80s, I decided to preach through Hebrews. Another commentaries I used in helping me, I found the book by John Brown, the commentary, published by the Banner of Truth, was most helpful. I found it extremely helpful. It was recommended by Spurgeon, and I certainly found it helpful, useful, beyond praise. But as I was preaching through Hebrews 3, and especially chapter 4, I found that my position on the Sabbath was changed. And as a result of preaching Hebrews 4, or trying to, I gave up being a Sabbatarian. I was still a Lord's Day man. That is, I regarded the first day of the week as Christ's day, the resurrection day. But it was no longer the Sabbath. The Sabbath was Old Covenant, the law, for Israel. So I was not a Sabbatarian. Now this was a chink in the armor. This was a break in the wall, a dislodgement of a vital part of the wall, and yet of covenant theology, and yet I didn't realize it. I just knew I was not Sabbatarian. I went on like that. I saw that baptism, contrary to the Reformed, is not a seal. It's a sign only. And so we took out that part of our confession saying it was a sign and a seal. Again, this was another brick, as it were, another stone dislodged from the wall of covenant theology. I didn't realize it, but it was there. In the mid-90s, I preached through Galatians. And once again, I used John Brown, this time on Galatians. And I found him excellent. Now, if my memory serves me right, there was one verse, and only one verse, late in the commentary, where he broke his rubric and changed the meaning of law from the entire Mosaic economy to the Ten Commandments. I found it inexplicable, but it was the only place. On the other hand, I was using Walt Chantry and his works. And Walt Chantry was a big man in the Banner of Truth. And this is what I found about Walt Chantry. He recommended John Brown. It's like the sun at noonday, he said. I think that was his illustration. It shines so well, and I agreed with him. It was a first-class commentary, apart from that one verse, on the entire book. But what I found Walt Chantry doing was this. And again, if my memory serves me right, it's somewhere about chapter 3. I noticed that he was, up to that point, using the understanding the law means the entire Mosaic economy, and suddenly, somewhere in chapter 3, he changed to the Ten Commandments, without any explanation as far as I could see, without any justification. It became without any scriptural warrant, it became the Ten Commandments, the moral law. And then somewhere in chapter 4, again, without any scriptural warrant, it switched back to the Mosaic economy. I don't want to be offensive, but this is how I feel about it. I found that was shoddy, and I thought it was wrong. And I maintained, as I should do, as Brown did, and I certainly do. I maintained the point that Paul was making throughout Galatians. He was speaking about the law. Of course, by doing that, by reading Paul as he wrote himself, and not switching about with a gloss into the moral law, of course I was shaking very seriously now covenant theology. I was becoming a new covenant man, a new covenant theology man. I didn't know the term, but that's what I was becoming. And this is the mid-90s now. At that time, I was doing some history lectures once a month on a Saturday in the church. And the first winter, I did Andrew Fuller and the hyper-Calvinistic controversy. The next winter, I proposed that I would do a series on the Puritans. And my reason for that was that I regarded the Puritans as the peak, the zenith, the acme of biblical exposition of the gospel. And I started that series on the Puritans with the intention of showing how great they were, how glorious they were, and how we should follow them. But as I began to prepare and lecture on the Puritans, I found to my amazement I was taking the contrary view. Of course they made a tremendous contribution. Of course they have much to teach us. But I found that the Puritans and Calvin were in the wrong in many areas, and the Anabaptists had more to teach us. This again, without realizing it, was driving me more and more away from covenant theology into the new covenant position. Not that I knew anything about it. To page back a little way, in the early 90s, I had traveled to America with my wife, preaching there, and visiting and preaching. And when I was there, they told me about my views. They told me that there were some American men who were taking a similar line. They were called Sovereign Grace Baptists. I didn't follow this up. There was no internet, at least I didn't have one, and no access to it, and I didn't follow it up. But then I was in the Americas again, in New England, in California, in the late 90s. And I was horrified by the lack of understanding about the Lord's Day. And so I wrote a series of emails to a gentleman I was staying with, 13 of them, and on the developing my view on the Lord's Day. I kept these, and when I came back to England, I decided to knock them together into some sort of manuscript on the Lord's Day. But in doing that, I found that I had to page back and do a first work on the law. By this time, I'd already published my Battle for the Church, which was my conclusion of going through the Puritans. And I decided I would publish on the law. And so I started working on it. A friend in England who supplies me with much literature, supplied much in this area, and my work began to grow. But again, I was still acting, as it were, in the dark, as it were, all alone. I had just a few friends around me, but I had no awareness that there was this massive movement going on. I suppose I could see it by the literature that was being produced. John Zenz and Fred Zaspel and others, and I was using their works, and they were benefiting me. And of course, I still kept my brethren principles underneath, and the priesthood of all believers, and the pastorate, so on. These were also working in my mind at the same time, and all was coming together, and I began to publish on these things. My book on the law I did not publish. I kept it there, working on it. It was growing like topsy all the time. Eventually I did publish. And by now I'm really confirmed in these things. I'm publishing more and more and preaching and discourses on it, on New Covenant theology. Not that I think at that stage I would have called it that, but that's where I was. And then out of the blue, I had an email from a man in Northern Ireland who urged me, eventually, gently, but he urged me to think about joining a certain Facebook group on New Covenant theology, New Covenant grace. I resisted. I said, no, I just get deluged with emails and I don't want it. But he gently insisted. And then one day he sent me a link. And he said, I think you'll be interested in this link. Well, I pressed it and had a look. And I was staggered. It was a man in America, New York, I think, or New England, taking a conference. And he had my book in his hand. And the subject was me. And my book, Christ is All, which I had published by then, the book on the law. I watched 5 minutes of this paper. I couldn't take any more. But this man was approving of my work and recommending it. I wrote to this man, email, and thanked him. And he, of course, was a member of this same Facebook group. My friend in Northern Ireland was still gently insisting. Another man was also joining in. And so I yielded. I thought, well, I can always get out. I can always leave if I want. But to my amazement, the response I got and the benefit I have gained has been immense. My friend in Northern Ireland said I will be able to contribute, and I hope I have. But I'm in the debt of these brothers and sisters. I've been so stimulated and encouraged and so instructed and informed by what I have read and challenged. It's been a tremendous blessing to me. And I recommend it to anybody who might be interested in it. You'll see some links below. Now, that's my testimony. As I look back upon it, this is what I see. I didn't come to New Covenant theology in a systematic way. I came to it by trying to expound Scripture. It wasn't that a system was brought to my attention and I explored it. I was trying to preach Hebrews and Galatians and then talk about the Puritans. And the more I explored Scripture and tried to preach Scripture, expound it, the more I was inevitably forced into the New Covenant position. My covenant theology was broken not because of a systematic study, but by trying to expound Scripture. And that's really what I recommend to you if you're interested in New Covenant theology. Read, and read out loud, I suggest, passages like Romans 6, 7, and 8, particularly the early chapters of Romans 7, but Romans 6, 7, and 8. Read the letter to the Galatians out loud. Hebrews, particularly 7, 8, 9, and 10. Read 2 Corinthians 3, Philippians 3, Ephesians 2, and so on, and so on. Read these passages aloud and try and set aside your catechism, your confession of faith, your system of theology, and let the apostles speak to you in their own words. And don't gloss them, receive them. I'm pretty confident that if you will do that and be a Berean, search the Scriptures, and let the Scripture speak, I'm pretty confident that you will come to New Covenant theology. I'm not advocating a system. I'm just advocating that you read and search the Scriptures. I have little doubt where you will end up. Of course, you'll be called names, you'll be ostracized, and if you're a preacher, you might lose preaching appointments and opportunities and so on. I'm well aware of all that, yes. But let God be true and every man a liar. Now that's my experience, that's my testimony. It was simply trying to expound Scripture, trying to say what Scripture was saying and preach it, that inevitably forced me into New Covenant theology. It wasn't other people around me, it wasn't a system, it was Scripture. And I hope and believe it was God's Spirit guiding me through those Scriptures. And therefore I commend the scriptural approach to you. And that's why I'm a New Covenant theologian, if you like. I'm a New Covenant man. Why? I can be nothing else. I feel like Luther. Here I stand. I can do no other. So help me God. What do you mean? My reading of Scripture leaves me with no other conclusion but the leading tenets of New Covenant theology. And that's why I advocate it. and that's why I advocate it to you now. Search the scriptures, my friend, and seeth these things. Be sound.